Before the Clone Wars, before the Grand Army of the Republic, before a single clone ever took aim at a single Jedi. There was another war, another empire, another Sith, an age when the dark side didn't whisper from the shadows, it ruled from a throne. This is the story of the nightmare the galaxy tried to erase, an empire of the Sith so vast, so violently ambitious, that every tyranny that came after it felt like an echo. The Galactic Empire, the Separatists, even Darth Sidious himself. All of them were living in the ruins of a terror that had already burned the galaxy once. Entire star systems vanished into fire, not metaphorical fire, actual orbital bombardment, atmosphere peeling, continent glassifying fire. Fleets of black-holed warships blotting out suns. Worlds where the only light left came from the turbo lasers that were killing them. The Jedi didn't just lose battles in those days. Entire branches of the Order were cut off and annihilated before they could even call the Council for help. On one world, a single Sith ritual ended everything. No survivors, no plants, no animals, no Force presence at all. Just a dead, silent sphere hanging in space where a living planet used to be. One emperor, thousands of Sith lords, and millions of unwilling victims, all drained into a single bottomless hunger. The galaxy never learned that name. The records were buried, classified, or simply forgotten. That was about to change very quickly, at least for anyone watching this timeline unfold. Because the ancient Sith weren't just a handful of robed fanatics hiding in basements. They were a civilization, red-skinned Sith born on Korriban, building tombs the size of cities and carving their hatred into stone. Exiled Dark Jedi arriving with stolen knowledge. Together, they created the first true Sith Empire, an entire culture calibrated for conquest. The planet was Korriban. The year was measured not in BBY, but in millennia before the Republic, that the Senate would later pretend had always existed. It wasn't a perfect system. It was older, harsher, and ruled by one principle: the strong command, the weak obey, and the dead feed the tombs. From Naga Sadow's fleets crashing into the Republic during the Great Hyperspace War to later emperors rebuilding in the unknown regions, the pattern stayed the same. The Sith Empire would rise in open war, terrify the galaxy, then vanish into legend. But the ideas never died. Dark councils, superweapons, rituals that treated planets as batteries. And here is the terrifying part. The most dangerous thing about this empire wasn't just its power, it was how completely the galaxy forgot it. Records lost, histories edited, Jedi archives trimmed down to cautionary footnotes. That amnesia created a blind spot big enough for Darth Bane, the Rule of Two, and eventually Darth Sidious and Order 66 to walk straight through. So this is the story of that forgotten terror. Around 7000 BBY, a group of defeated Dark Jedi were exiled from the Republic. They fled into uncharted space and landed on Korriban. The planet was Korriban. The year was roughly 6900 BBY. Those exiles conquered and interbred with the native Sith species, creating a hybrid ruling caste and the first true Sith Empire. An entire civilization built on the dark side, ruled by sorcerer kings and enforced by armies of slaves and monsters the Council would have nightmares about. That was about to change very quickly once the Republic actually found them. In the Great Hyperspace War, Naga Sadow pushed this hidden empire into the open. Sith fleets burst out of hyperspace, hit Republic worlds, and for a moment the galaxy saw what a dark side theocracy with a standing army could really do. It almost worked. Then it collapsed in fire, civil war, and one disastrous retreat after another. The Sith were extinct again, or so the Senate was told. This is the story of how that extinction kept not happening. Because in the ashes of that defeat, another Sith rose, Tenebrae, later known as Vitiate. He performed a ritual on Nathema so extreme it erased the force presence of an entire world, including thousands of Sith Lords, just to make himself effectively immortal. Then he vanished into the unknown regions and built a new Sith Empire in secret. Centuries later, that hidden empire came roaring back in the Great Galactic War and the Cold War era, sacking Coruscant, forcing humiliating treaties and proving that the Jedi and Republic could be outplayed on a galactic scale. Across all of this, a macro pattern emerges. These empires created the blueprint, the myths, and the scars that Darth Bane would study after yet another Sith civil war. Bane looked at millennia of Sith history, saw that it wasn't a perfect system, and rewrote the rulebook into the rule of two. Sidious then treated those ancient empires as a design document. Their propaganda, their superweapons, their infiltration of Republic institutions. He refined all of it. So the timeline for this video runs from those first Dark Jedi exiles on Korriban, through Naga Sadow's Great Hyperspace War, into Vitiate's Great Galactic War, and the uneasy Cold War that followed, thousands of years before the Battle of Naboo. Era by era. Origins, rise, peak terror, collapse, and legacy. And at every step, the story will keep snapping back to what the audience already knows. Jedi arrogance on the eve of the Clone Wars, a complacent Senate, a republic that trusts emergency powers a little too easily, because there's a mystery running under all of it. If these Sith empires were strong enough to sack Coruscant, to nearly erase the Jedi, to hold the galaxy in a permanent state of war, why did they fall? Was it the Republic's resilience, the Jedi's heroism, or something stepping off a single shuttle? They spent as much time in archives and meditation chambers as they did in negotiation halls, focusing on mediation, exploration, and quiet diplomacy. When disputes flared between planets, a pair of Jedi might arrive to arbitrate, not to command an army or occupy a capital. They were peacekeepers, not generals, philosophers with lightsabers. The Council did not plan campaigns. It debated ethics. The idea of a clone battalion saluting a Jedi commander would have sounded absurd. The Republic had no standing war machine waiting to be activated, and the Jedi had no doctrine for directing fleet actions or coordinating system-wide defenses. That was about to change very quickly, but in this age, the Order's power was moral and symbolic more than military. Underneath that hopeful image, the Republic's structure was already cracking. Representation in the Senate skewed heavily toward prosperous core worlds. Frontier systems, cut off by dangerous hyperlanes and unreliable communications, were technically members but practically on their own. Pirates hit shipping routes with impunity. Local warlords rose, declared themselves protectors, and sometimes never gave that power back. Resentment brewed in those border regions, a quiet conviction that Coruscant cared more about debates than about starving colonies. Those neglected worlds are important because they are exactly the kind of places the Sith would later weaponize. A planet that has watched the Republic ignore its distress calls for a decade is very ready to listen when someone offers protection, power, and revenge. Even in this peaceful age, the dark side was not a myth. It was there in the margins, rogue Dark Jedi who broke from the Order, dueling their former comrades on forgotten moons, internal schisms over whether passion could be a path to strength, philosophical disputes about whether the Force existed to be served or to be used. The word Sith existed in old archives and half-remembered legends, but it meant ancient monsters, not a living empire. That distinction would not last. One of those Jedi schisms was about to go too far. A group of Dark Jedi would be defeated, exiled beyond known hyperlanes and pushed into the uncharted dark. Out there, they would find a red-skinned species steeped in the dark side, ruling from tomb worlds on Korriban and Ziost. And together, exile and native, they would forge something the Republic had never prepared for, a Sith Empire that did not need the Senate's permission for anything. The planet was Korriban. The year was irrelevant. What mattered was that, for the first time, the dark side had a civilization, and it was about to knock on the Republic's door. Korriban was not a homeworld. It was a warning. Endless red deserts under a dying sun, jagged mountain ranges carved into colossal faces, their stone eyes staring down at anyone foolish enough to walk the valley floor. The air itself felt heavy, soaked in a pressure that was not weather, not geology. It was the dark side, pooled and stagnant, the original Sith. Not robed human cultists yet, but a distinct red-skinned species, with bone spurs crowning their faces and eyes that mirrored the storms around them. They did not discover the dark side the way the Jedi did. They grew up inside it. Their priests and kings wielded it through sorcery, alchemy, and ritual, using blood and sigils to bend creatures, weather, and even their own bodies into weapons. This was the story of a civilization that treated cruelty as infrastructure. Slavery underpinned everything. Lesser Sith and conquered aliens hauled stones for temples, dug mass graves, and marched as expendable soldiers in endless clan wars. Alchemical experiments turned some of them into warped guardians, bound to tombs they would never leave. It wasn't a perfect system. It was efficient in the way a meat grinder is efficient. Politically, the Sith species were a network of city-states and warring clans. Above them stood Sith lords, whose power in the Force was the only real constitution. Rule was simple: dominate or be dominated. Assassination, ritual combat, and betrayal were accepted transfer of power mechanisms. When a lord fell, their rivals looted their tombs before the body cooled, hunting for talismans and scrolls that might tip the next war. Isolated in the outer rim, beyond the Republic's charts, the Sith developed alone. Their language, their religion, their entire understanding of the Force evolved without a single Jedi to argue with them. To the Council, the dark side was a cosmic imbalance. To the Sith on Korriban, it was a birthright and a weapon, proof that the galaxy rewarded those willing to take. And then, far away, a different conflict began. A war among the Jedi themselves. Ambitious knights delved into forbidden techniques, lost, and were cast out. That was about to change very quickly for Korriban, because those defeated Dark Jedi needed somewhere to run. Their exile would not end in oblivion. It would end in the waiting arms of a red-skinned empire that already spoke the language of the dark. The Jedi Order was supposed to be united. One council, one code, one luminous path through the Force. This is the story of how that unity cracked, and how the fracture didn't just scar the Order, it created an empire dedicated to its destruction. In the early days, the Jedi were still experimenting with what it meant to serve the Republic. There was no Senate Oversight Committee, no standardized training holocron for every temple outpost. It wasn't a perfect system. Some knights began pushing the boundaries, treating the dark side not as a danger to be contained, but as a weapon to be mastered. They studied forbidden rituals, drained life to fuel telekinesis, and used battle meditation to break enemy armies instead of end wars quickly. At first, the Council tried censure, then confinement. Then, when those measures failed, the schism turned into open war. Jedi against Jedi, quiet graveyard. They found the original Sith species, red-skinned, fiercely hierarchical, already comfortable with sacrifice, sorcery, and rule by fear. To a culture that worshipped power, These pale off-worlders who could choke a chieftain from across a throne room looked very close to gods. Conquest followed quickly. The Dark Jedi used their weapons, their ships, and their Force abilities to topple Sith warlords and seize the Valley of the Dark Lords. But they did not just rule from above. They interbred with the Sith, creating a new hybrid aristocracy. Half exiled Jedi, half native Sith. Jedi telekinesis fused with Sith alchemy. Battle meditation merged with blood rites and spirit binding. That mixture produced something uniquely dangerous. A hereditary class of dark side nobles, trained from birth to see domination as their birthright. From that fusion came the first true Sith Empire, a theocracy of the strong, armed with the Force, backed by armies of Sith slaves and warriors, and led by lords who remembered exactly who had cast them out. The Jedi thought they had cut away a tumor. Instead, they had concentrated it, given it a throne, and pointed it at the Republic. And now, in the shadows beyond known space, an empire nursed a generational hatred and started planning its return. That hatred needed a shape. It needed laws, ranks, banners, and a throne. The Dark Jedi exiles were not content to rule scattered villages on a graveyard world. So they did what the Jedi Council had never imagined they could do. They turned chaos into an institution. Clan chieftains were dragged into vast stone halls on Korriban and Ziost, made to kneel before beings who called themselves Dark Lords of the Sith. Bloodlines that had once feuded over caves and burial grounds were folded into a rigid hierarchy. Lords at the top, overseers in the middle, and endless tiers of slaves at the bottom. It wasn't a perfect system. It was better than that. It was efficient cruelty. This is the story of a theocracy built around a wound in the Force. In the new Sith Empire, the dark side was not just a philosophy, it was state religion, legal code, and foreign policy. Temples rose from the red sands, pyramids of black stone that doubled as cathedrals and command bunkers. Priests were generals, acolytes were officers. Inside, war rooms and ritual chambers were the same space, because every campaign began as an act of worship and ended as an act of conquest. Slavery made it all possible. Prisoners of war, rival clans, even their own weak, were branded and chained. Entire populations were marched into mines on Ziost or shipyards in orbit, building an army for masters they would never meet. The Republic used committees and Senate votes. The Sith used collars. That was about to change very quickly, because the Empire was not just building whips and swords, it was building technology. The exiles brought with them stolen Jedi teachings. Friendships were encouraged, then deliberately shattered in final trials where only one initiate walked out. The result was an elite ruling class that was brilliant, ambitious, and permanently unstable. Every promotion carried a funeral. Every victory planted the seed of the next civil war. For centuries, this empire expanded in the dark, conquering nearby systems, erasing records, watching the distant glow of Republic beacons with cold patience. Hyperlanes were charted, fleets were tested, and the Dark Lords argued only about timing. And then, on a quiet day, a single navigation error would send a Republic ship into forbidden space and give the Sith Empire exactly what it had been waiting for. That quiet day became the most dangerous navigation error in galactic history. Two names, two ordinary explorers, Gav Daragon and Jory Daragon. They weren't heroes, they weren't Sith, they were freelance hyperspace mappers from the Republic, running outdated charts and gambling their lives on untested routes because the Senate paid better for shortcuts than for safety. It wasn't a perfect system. Their family business was failing. Their ship, the Starbreaker 12, was barely holding together, and creditors were closing in. So they did the one thing every cautious navigator swore never to do. They jumped blind, on a speculative route no beacon had ever confirmed. The planet was Korriban. The year was roughly 5,000 years before the films. Their misjump hurled them straight into the funeral procession of a Dark Lord of the Sith, right as the hidden Empire was arguing about succession. 1 second, empty hyperspace. The next, a lone Republic ship dropping out over a sacred tomb world the galaxy was supposed to have forgotten. This was the story of a random contract job turning into a civilizational crisis. The Sith reaction was instant and vicious. Shock first. Outsiders had found them. That was supposed to be impossible. For 1,000 years, the old Sith Empire had buried its hyperlanes, erased its presence from Republic records, and relied on distance and fear to stay invisible. Then the opportunism hit. Different Sith Lords wanted different outcomes. Some argued for immediate execution, burn the ship, kill the pilots, and hope the secret died with them. Others saw leverage, interrogate them, steal their charts, trace their route back to the Republic. Naga Sadow listened harder than anyone. Ambitious, brilliant, and very aware that his rivals on the Sith Council preferred stagnation over risk, Sadow saw Gav and Jory as a gift from the dark side. Here was proof the Republic still existed, that its trade routes still pulsed with undefended wealth and unprepared worlds. More importantly, here was a ready-made pretext. The Republic had invaded Sith space. Now the Sith could claim they were only striking back. Back in the core, the Republic had no idea any of this was happening. To the Senate and the Jedi Council, the Sith were a distant legend, a cautionary tale about fallen Jedi and forgotten wars. Was a leader willing to gamble everything on a single roll of the galactic dice? That was about to change very quickly. Naga Sadow was not interested in guarding forgotten tombs on Korriban. He saw an empire trapped in its own shadows, ruling a cluster of worlds while the rest of the galaxy pretended the Sith were a myth. This is the story of the first Sith Lord who looked at the Republic, at the Jedi, and decided they were not distant threats to be feared, but prizes to be taken. He was powerful, ambitious, and genuinely visionary. In a culture built on the rule of the strong, long before there was a formal rule of two, Sadow believed strength meant expansion. The Sith were not meant to be a hidden empire on the fringe. They were destined to replace the Republic as the default order of the galaxy. That belief would drive every reckless decision that followed. The Daragons gave him the opening. 2 lost hyperspace explorers, 1 captured Jedi-aligned family in Sith custody. Sadow looked at them and saw more than prisoners. He saw leverage. So he staged a crisis. Using loyalists and illusion, he faked a Republic assault on the Sith capital of Ziost, bombarding his own people to make it look real. The planet was Ziost. The year was nearly 5,000 years before the Battle of Yavin. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was enough. The Republic attack enraged the Sith Council. Sadow pointed to his rival, Ludo Kresh, as the traitor who had somehow invited the enemy in. In the confusion, he orchestrated a prison break for the Daragons, then rescued them himself, posing as the only lord capable of repelling this supposed Republic incursion. By the time the dust settled, Kresh was discredited, the council was terrified, and Naga Sadow was acclaimed Dark Lord of the Sith. One staged war had just given him the power to start a real one. As Dark Lord Sadow thought in terms of spectacle, his plan for the Great Hyperspace War was not a conventional invasion, it was psychological warfare on a galactic scale. He used Sith sorcery to project phantom fleets, false reinforcements, and illusory planetary bombardments, forcing Republic commanders to split their defenses against threats that weren't there. His battle meditation, amplified Sith morale, and magnified Republic fear, turning every skirmish into a rumor of unstoppable Sith armies. Entire systems surrendered to shadows. Worlds capitulated after seeing thousands of Sith warships that existed only in Sadow's mind and their sensors. It was efficient, in a terrifyingly theatrical way. But Sadow's genius came with blind spots. He assumed the Republic Senate would panic and fold under pressure, that the Jedi Council would be too slow and conservative to adapt to sorcery and illusion. Instead, the Jedi treated the war as a puzzle to be solved. They learned to distinguish real fleets from phantoms, to anchor themselves in the Force against his terror. The Republic dragged from tomb worlds and alchemical vats, massive hulks that shrugged off small arms fire, winged horrors that dove straight through transparasteel to tear apart command centers. The Republic had seen pirate raids and separatists, but nothing that treated civilian cities as test ranges for occult biology. And then there were the fleets that weren't really there. Naga Sadow was not just a warlord. He was a sorcerer who understood that terror could do more damage than any turbo laser. Across the galaxy, his meditation spheres projected illusions into real space. Single cruisers appeared as armadas. Minor skirmishes looked like full planetary encirclements. On one world, defenders saw 3 separate Sith armadas converging and surrendered before the first landing craft touched down. The ships overhead were already retreating to hit the next target. Jedi Masters reported phantom signatures in the Force, enemy auras that multiplied and vanished. Council tacticians tried to plot sensible fleet movements and watched their maps melt into nonsense. This is the story of a war where half the enemy's strength existed only in the collective panic of the Republic. The response was chaotic, then desperate, then barely coherent. The Republic had a navy, but not one built for a sudden, coordinated invasion across dozens of sectors. Sector forces threw together scratch defense coalitions. A few cruisers here, planetary militias there, whatever could jump to coordinates that changed by the hour. Jedi took whatever ships they could find and raced from world to world, trading rest for hyperspace jumps. For the first time in history, massed Jedi met massed Sith on open battlefields. Lines of red blades crashed into walls of blue and green. Behind the Sith warriors, robed adepts hurled storms of dark side lightning and battle meditation, amplifying fear in the minds of clone ancestors and civilian crews who had never trained for this. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was enough to make veteran captains break formation at the worst possible moment. That was about to change very quickly. The same rivalries Sadow had exploited to seize the Sith throne followed him into the war. His fleets were overextended. His logistics ran through long, vulnerable hyperspace corridors, and while his illusions magnified apparent strength, they couldn't conjure fuel, munitions, or spare parts. When rival Sith lords hesitated to send reinforcements or quietly held back, hoping Sadow would bleed out, the cracks became fault lines. Jedi scouts finally piecing together real fleet positions beneath the illusions led precision counterstrikes. Hit the supply depots, not the phantoms. Target the isolated spearheads that had outrun their support. In system after system, the Republic stopped trying to win every battle and began trying to collapse the invasion spine. The result was not a glorious sweeping victory. It was a narrow escape. Whole sectors burned. Worlds were glassed. The Senate survived. The Council survived, but both emerged shaken, aware that one more terrified prisoners. The planet was Korriban. The year was thousands of years before the Clone Wars. Jedi cruisers dropped out of hyperspace over the Sith Holy World and opened fire. Sith temples that had stood for millennia vanished under turbo laser barrages. Tombs cracked open, not by ritual, but by orbital bombardment. On Ziost, on Relg, on lesser fortress worlds whose names barely survived in Jedi archives, the pattern repeated. This was the story of a republic that had spent 25,000 years on defense, suddenly discovering what total war looked like when it pointed outward. On the ground, Jedi strike teams cut through what remained of the Sith military. Lords who had once commanded legions now died in duels in burning courtyards, their armies broken, their sorcery useless against mass drivers and coordinated fleets. The central Sith government, already weakened by Sadow's coup and civil war, collapsed in months. The Dark Council chambers went silent. The throne on Ziost stood empty. That was about to change very quickly for the Sith species itself. The red-skinned natives of Korriban and Ziost had already been diluted by generations of Dark Jedi intermarriage. Now they were simply targets. Temples were toppled, academies razed, bloodlines erased in what was, functionally, a cultural execution. Surviving Sith retreated into tombs and caverns. Most never came back out. An entire civilization that had ruled sectors of the galaxy was reduced to scattered warlords, cults, and refugees, arguing over whose god-king had failed least. But extinction was only the surface story. Beneath it, something else moved. In the chaos, some Sith lords refused to die for a failed empire. They gathered loyalists, slaves, and whatever ships still worked. They stripped libraries, looted armories, and loaded holocrons and artifacts onto battered cruisers. Then they disappeared into regions the Republic star chart simply marked as blank. This was the Sith Exodus. Not one fleet, but dozens of little arcs, each carrying its own version of the truth, its own grudge, and its own memory of empire. The Republic chose to see that as an ending. The Senate had casualties to count, worlds to rebuild, trade routes to reopen. The Jedi Council wrote the Great Hyperspace War into their holocrons as a warning about arrogance and attachment to power. It wasn't a perfect system. Over centuries, those records gathered dust. Over millennia, they blurred into legend. A Sith Empire became a cautionary myth, not a current threat. Except one thread of that exodus did not vanish. On a backwater world called Medrias, a young Sith Lord named Tenebrae, later known as Vitiate, had survived the collapse. He called surviving Sith to him under the promise of salvation and performed a ritual so vast it erased his own planet from the Force. Narthema died, Vitiate did not. He took their lands, their soldiers, their fear, and folded it all into himself. So, what Obi-Wan found, centuries later, was a Jedi Order haunted by Sith legends that did not begin with Sidious. Tenebrae was one of those legends. While the Great Hyperspace War shattered Naga Sadow's old empire and sent Sith warlords fleeing into the unknown regions, Tenebrae treated the chaos as a promotion opportunity. Where others fought over scraps, he stayed very still, very patient. He studied. On Medrias, soon to be renamed Narthema, he dug into the oldest Sith records, predating even Korriban's great tombs. Rituals that the Dark Council had banned as too dangerous for the Empire. That phrase, to Tenebrae, read more like a recommendation. He learned how to anchor consciousness, how to drain life, how to bind an entire planet into a single equation with one variable, himself. Psychologically, he did not resemble the more familiar Sith. No theatrical rages, no dueling for honor. Tenebrae did not want glory in war or a seat on a council. He wanted a guarantee, immortality, absolute control over every mind and every outcome. If the average Sith saw enemies and rivals, Tenebrae saw batteries. The Republic, the Jedi, the separatists of that age, even his own army of acolytes, everything was fuel. After the Great Hyperspace War, With the old Sith hierarchy in ruins, he made his move. He sent out a call to surviving Sith Lords, promising a grand ritual that would restore their empire, avenge their defeat, and unleash a power that would finally crush the Republic. It sounded plausible. It sounded tempting. It wasn't a perfect system, but desperation covered the gaps. One by one, they came to Nathema, bringing followers, artifacts, entire retinues of warriors and slaves. They thought they were co-authors of a new age. In reality, they were ingredients. The ritual Tenebrae prepared there, now as Vitiate, was the purest expression of Sith horror ever attempted, not a weapon aimed at an enemy fleet. A weapon aimed at his own world. Annihilate every living thing on Nathema, convert an entire biosphere into power. And in doing so, turn one Sith Lord into something the galaxy had never seen before. An emperor who did not intend to die. He was ready to begin. The planet was Medrias. The year was buried so deep in forgotten archives that even the Jedi Council would only whisper about it later. Across the old Sith domains, messengers went out carrying one promise from a little-known Dark Lord named Vitiate, a grand ritual to restore the glory lost in the Great Hyperspace War. Power for all who answered, revenge on the Republic, a second chance for a defeated Sith Empire. They came in droves, thousands of Sith Lords and acolytes, the remnants of armies that had once tried to burn the galaxy. Battle-scarred survivors of Naga Sadow's fail or any external enemy. He was bending it inward. In a single catastrophic turn, the ritual inverted. The lattice of runes became a drain. The chanting Sith felt their strength ripped away, their life essence unspooling into the vortex at the center where Vitiate stood. Not just them. Forests withered mid-gust, oceans went still, animals, insects, microbes, anything that lived, had the force torn out of it. Medrias didn't burn or shatter, it emptied. When the storm ended, there was no screaming. There was nothing. The planet's surface turned silent and colorless, a flat grey tomb under a dead sky. No wind, no birds, no distant hum of life. Even for sensitive Jedi, the Force itself would feel missing, as if someone had deleted a page from reality. At the center of that void stood Vitiate, now more than a Sith Lord, less than a man, effectively immortal, immeasurably empowered. Word of what happened leaked out in fragments, holocrons corrupted by static, survivors driven mad just by orbiting the world. Even hardened Sith, centuries later, recoiled from the truth. This wasn't conquest, this was consumption. Vitiate had treated an entire civilization as a battery and the Force as fuel. Medrias gained a new name, Nathema, a planet that had died so an emperor could live. And in that emptiness, Vitiate saw a blueprint. If one world could be drained to build a single immortal ruler, what could an entire hidden empire in the unknown regions achieve? The galaxy was quiet. For the moment, the galaxy was quiet. For the moment. Because on a dead world with no wind and no life, an emperor who refused to die was already issuing orders. Vitiate's command to the surviving Sith was simple and absolute. Abandon everything. The old capitals on Korriban and Ziost, the ruined strongholds from the Great Hyperspace War, the shattered fleets still limping through known space. All of it was now a liability. The Republic and the Jedi would hunt the survivors down one by one. So the Emperor offered them a different future. Follow him into the unknown regions and build an empire that would never make the same mistake twice. This is the story of an entire civilization hitting the galactic eject button. Sith warships began to vanish from charts and hyperlanes. Not destroyed in battle, not captured, just gone. Convoys slipped away from the borders of the Republic, jumped to rendezvous points only Vitiate's navigators knew. and then plunged into uncharted hyperspace. No beacons, no trade routes, no Senate reports. If a ship miscalculated, it disappeared forever into the dark between stars. It was a brutal filter. The weak, the unlucky, the disloyal did not arrive. Those who survived emerged into a region the Republic's maps simply stopped trying to describe. That was about to change very quickly. After years of cautious jumps and sacrificed scouts, Vitiate scouts found a world heavy with storms and darker with potential. The planet was Dromund Kaas. The year was irrelevant and replaced one another in an endless cycle, while the Emperor remained untouched above the storm. Competition culled the weak, fear disciplined the strong. Culture became a weapon. Children were raised on stories of betrayal by the Republic and weakness in the Jedi. The army was everything, legions drilled for planetary invasions, fleets trained to strike and vanish, intelligence services that turned paranoia into policy. Every promotion, every privilege was tied to readiness for war that officially did not exist. And all of it happened in the dark. For over 1,000 years, this hidden Sith Empire expanded in secrecy. Shipyards in orbit over Dromund Kaas and its neighboring systems turned out cruisers and battle cruisers the Republic had never classified. Academies on Korriban, reclaimed and now treated as a sacred training ground, produced generations of Sith who had never seen Coruscant but knew exactly how they planned to burn it. Laboratories refined rituals and superweapons, from thought plagues to planet-cracking bombardment doctrines, each designed to finish what Nathema had started on a galactic scale. Back in the core, the Republic entered what historians would later call a golden age. Trade flourished. The Senate argued about tariffs instead of invasions. The Jedi Council relaxed, convinced the Sith were a closed chapter, a cautionary tale for Padawans. Peacekeeping replaced war. The galaxy forgot what a true Sith Empire looked like. But the unknown regions had not forgotten the galaxy. Somewhere beyond the last Republic probe, an immortal emperor presided over an armory no one had seen and an army no one had counted. This quiet was not peace, it was aim. And when that aim finally swung back toward the Republic, the first warning would not be a diplomatic message. It would be a war. The warning shot was not subtle. It was an entire civilization arriving out of nowhere, already armed, already brutal, already convinced the galaxy belonged to the Sith. This is the story of what that looked like from the inside. At the top sat the Dark Council, 12 Sith Lords, each holding a sphere of power. Military offense, military defense, intelligence, ancient knowledge, logistics, even mysteries no one else was allowed to define. On paper, it was division of labor. In practice, it was a permanent knife fight conducted in conference. Every decree, every campaign plan, every supply allocation was also a move in an invisible war for favor beneath an emperor who almost never appeared, but always knew who had hesitated. The rule of the strong was not a slogan, it was the operating system. Advancement did not come from seniority or elections, it came from survival. Apprentices were trained, armed, and then expected to kill their masters when they grew powerful enough. Officers in the Imperial Army understood that a promotion might arrive as a datapad off towers while crowds were ordered to watch. A child growing up in the Empire learned very early that a casual gesture from a black-robed figure could snap a spine. It wasn't a perfect system. It bled talent, loyalty, and basic sanity at a terrifying rate. But fear filled the gaps that law never could. Behind that spectacle stood the real engine, the military. Disciplined Imperial troops drilled endlessly, their armor and formations echoing what the Republic would one day call stormtroopers. Above them, fanatical Sith warriors led charges personally, treating every battlefield as an audition for the Dark Council. Massive warships, from Harrower-class dreadnoughts to mobile shipyards, carried superweapons and alchemical plagues. Entire fleets were consecrated with dark side rituals designed not just to kill enemies, but to break them, to send survivors running back to the Republic with stories that did more damage than any turbo laser. So what Obi-Wan found in the Clone Wars was not an original blueprint for tyranny, it was an echo, a refinement of something the galaxy had already survived once. And that raises the central problem. How does a society this unstable, this self-cannibalizing, manage to function long enough to challenge the Republic on equal footing at all? The answer is, it didn't. Not in any way the Republic would recognize. The Sith Empire survived by disappearing, not by reforming, not by making peace, but by going dark. For more than 1,000 years after Nathema, Vitiate's realm existed in the blind spots of the galaxy, building an economy, an army, and a culture that knew nothing except war and obedience. Generations were born under that red-black banner. Children grew up in academies where failure meant pain and success meant command. Entire sectors turned into foundries and shipyards, feeding a war machine that technically wasn't at war with anyone yet. It wasn't a perfect system. It burned through lives and worlds at an incredible rate, but in the short term, it worked. The Empire industrialized in the shadows, while the Republic convinced itself the Sith were an ancient myth. This is the story of a Cold War where only one side knows it's happening. Sith intelligence became an art form. Agents slipped into fringe Republic space as merchants, navigators, even minor diplomats. They intercepted HoloNet traffic, copied Senate reports, and quietly mapped hyperlanes the Republic barely patrolled anymore. Scout flotillas trailed far behind legitimate trade, logging which systems had planetary shields, which had only a customs corvette and wishful thinking. On Dromund Kaas, analysts built star charts of vulnerabilities the Senate would not discover for centuries. Hyperlane junctions, fuel depots, relay stations that, if destroyed, would blind whole sectors. The Empire learned the Republic's defensive doctrine in detail. The Republic, meanwhile, did not even remember the Empire existed. Back in the core, complacency became policy. The Senate argued over tax routes and trade disputes. The Council chased boarding actions, while Sith Lords refined battle meditation, turning entire fleets into extensions of a single will. In secluded temples, dark rituals were standardized, catalogued and taught, ways to strip courage from enemy crews, to cloud the perceptions of Jedi across light years. Three things advanced together: industry, doctrine, and ideology. The factories produced the hulls, the academies produced the officers, the temples produced the terror. The planet was Dromund Kaas. The year was deliberately forgotten by everyone else. And then, after a millennium of silent preparation, Vitiate saw his moment, a republic stretched thin by internal disputes, a Jedi order distracted by border wars and internal council politics, hyperlanes charted, weak points tagged. The Great Galactic War was not an explosion out of nowhere. It was a trap that had been wired for 1,000 years, and the Emperor was finally ready to flip the switch. The switch didn't flip with a super weapon or a Senate declaration. It started with a distress call from nowhere. On the galactic fringe, beyond the tidy lanes of Republic star charts, outposts began to go dark. A listening post in the Tion hegemony, a refueling station along an obscure hyperlane near the unknown regions. The planet was unimportant. The year was peaceful. That was about to change very quickly. Patrol ships arrived to find the same scene repeated. Holes cut with surgical precision, defense grids bypassed, not overwhelmed. Garrison troops dead in seconds, not hours. Whoever hit them didn't linger, didn't loot, and didn't broadcast demands. They slipped in, dismantled a Republic presence, and vanished back into the dark. The only real clues were what they left behind. Fragments of unfamiliar hull plating, sensor ghosts of capital-grade firepower compressed into cruiser-sized silhouettes, and, on one station, a scorched boarding tube lined with alloy the Jedi Council's archivists could not match to any known navy. This is the story of the Republic's first contact with an enemy it had already forgotten. On Coruscant, the Senate argued over the meaning of the wreckage. Some called them pirates with better funding. Others insisted it was a new regional power, a fringe confederacy that could be handled with a few task forces and a speech. A handful of older historians whispered another word in back rooms and committee halls: Sith. That word did not play well on the Senate floor. Sith were legends, cautionary tales, convenient villains for lectures on the dangers of unchecked ambition. Turning those myths into a real strategic threat would mean admitting the Republic's defenses were built on an assumption that the last war had actually ended. It wasn't a perfect system, so the debates dragged, special committees formed, reports were requested, delayed, revised. While the senators measured their language, Vitiate measured their reaction times. Every skirmish on the fringe was a lot to confront. Even the Jedi hesitated to call it what it was. That hesitation was the final test result Vitiate needed. When the Great Galactic War finally opened, it would not begin with another anonymous raid. It would begin with a synchronized, multi-front assault, fleets dropping on core worlds and border sectors in the same hour, strike teams aimed directly at Jedi command nodes, and political shockwaves timed for maximum chaos. The Republic thought it was chasing pirates on the fringe. The Sith Empire was about to show it had been rehearsing for a war the Republic was nowhere near prepared to fight. The Great Galactic War, fleets igniting entire sectors at once. A Republic that had spent 1,000 years believing the Sith were a myth, suddenly watching that myth arrive in orbit with turbo lasers hot. It began without warning, no declaration, no border skirmish to ease anyone into it. Sith armadas, translated out of hyperspace above key worlds in the same hour. Core trade nexuses, mid-rim shipyards, border fortresses that had not fired in anger for generations. The opening wave was pure saturation, too many targets, not enough defenders. Republic commanders had to decide, in real time, which planets to save and which to abandon. On worlds like Bothawui and Balmora, local defense fleets held out for minutes, not days. Scythe capital ships were heavier, their formations drilled, their fighter wings flown by pilots raised from childhood for nothing but war. This is the story of an empire that had spent decades rehearsing the first move, and it showed. The Republic stretched its navy across half the map, and still the gaps just kept widening. Back on Coruscant, the Senate moved fast, but this time from a place of raw panic. Emergency committees convened overnight. Intelligence briefings hit the floor in open session. The first captured hollows of robed figures wielding red blades reached the Chancellor's podium, and the room went silent. These weren't pirates with stolen cruisers. This was a uniformed Sith Empire with a central command structure, a Dark Council, and reports, at first dismissed as hysteria, of an immortal emperor who had already outlived entire generations. In the Jedi Temple, the Council watched the same recordings. Sith warriors cutting through trained soldiers with choreographed brutality. Ritual strikes on Jedi outposts, timed to the minute with fleet arrivals. The Order had spent centuries as peacekeepers and negotiators. That was about to change very quickly. Now they were being asked to improvise a grand strategy against an enemy that had built its entire civilization around the idea of permanent war. Early on, the imbalance was obvious. At Korriban, the planet was dust and tombs. The year was a new age of terror, and yet Sith forces turned it into a forward operating base in days, daring the Republic to come and take it. At Alderaan's distant shipyards, precision raids severed supply lines before it was not a border conflict. This was a galaxy-spanning war that would burn across decades, redraw entire star maps, and leave scars still visible in the film era, scars in doctrine, in architecture, in how the Republic even thought about security. And the worst blow of the war hadn't landed yet. Because the Sith weren't just winning battles. They were rewriting what security meant in the galaxy. This is the story of an empire that understood something the Republic never really grasped. You don't have to annihilate an enemy to beat them. You just have to make it impossible for their armies to move, for their fleets to meet, for their citizens to believe the Senate can keep them safe. So the Sith started with the arteries of the Republic, not random worlds, hyperlanes, the Hydean Way, the Perlemian, the lesser-known corridors that linked shipyards, agri-worlds and fuel depots into a single nervous system. Seize a junction here, mine a corridor there, turn one major shipyard into slag, and suddenly a galaxy-spanning war machine discovers that half its fleets are stuck in the wrong sector, waiting for escort that can't arrive. The planet was X. The year was Y. On the map, it was just another raid on a refueling station. In reality, it was the third in a chain of strikes that left entire sectors rationing Tiabana gas and Starship-grade alloys. The Jedi could still win engagements. The Republic could still draft more crews. But every victory cost more credits, more fuel, more time. It wasn't a perfect system. That was exactly the point. On top of that economic chokehold, the Sith layered something far uglier. Terror as doctrine. Civilian centers were not collateral damage. They were primary targets. Planetary shields would drop under precision bombardment, and instead of hitting fortresses, the first volleys would walk across city grids, hospitals, power plants. There were public massacres broadcast on open channels, orbital strikes timed to Senate debates, and whole townships erased to make an example of a single governor who hesitated to surrender. Why waste months on a siege when one afternoon of horror could make a world capitulate? The Jedi called it barbaric. The Sith called it efficient. Behind those fleets and firestorms, infiltration did the slow work. Agents embedded in the Republic military, in the bureaucracy, even in the advisory staff surrounding key senators and council liaisons. Some were sleeper cells from the old Great Hyperspace War. Others were freshly turned officers, blackmailed quartermasters, ambitious aides. They fed targeting data to the Empire, delayed convoy departures, misfiled defense upgrades, and at decisive moments, they simply shut things off. A shield grid that mysteriously fails as the enemy drops out of hyperspace. A munitions depot that accidentally vents to vacuum. The result was a war that never quite resolved. Every time the Republic thought it had the Sith cornered, a hyperlane would become unusable, a key general would be discredited, a core anything. Senators, Jedi, Sith lords in ceremonial armor. Holocams broadcasting to a galaxy that wanted, desperately, to believe in peace. This is the story of a ceasefire that was never meant to exist. Because while diplomats traded phrased concessions and the Alderaanian hosts quoted ancient treaties, the real negotiation was happening in hyperspace. A hidden Sith strike force, assembled in total radio silence, dropped out of hyperspace directly into Coruscant's shadow. They hadn't broken the Republic's defenses. They had gone around them, secret routes, through the deep core, insider intelligence from corrupted officials and disillusioned officers. Whole security grids quietly reprogrammed weeks earlier so that, on that one day, the alarm simply did not trigger fast enough. The Republic thought its capital was a fortress. The Sith treated it as an unlocked door. The first warning on Coruscant was not an early alert ping in the Senate. It was fire. Sith warships opened up on orbital platforms and traffic control stations, blinding sensors and jamming comms. Dropships rode the shockwaves down into the atmosphere. Within minutes, black armored troops were in the skylanes, forcing civilian speeders aside as they drove straight for 3 targets: the Jedi Temple, the government district, and the planetary defense hubs. At the Temple, the war arrived in its purest form. Transports slammed into the landing decks. Sith warriors, trained for years on worlds the Republic had never mapped, poured out. Red and violet blades cut through the morning haze. Jedi met them on the steps, in the great halls, in the archives that were supposed to be sacred. Masters fell buying time for Padawans. Padawans fell buying time for younglings. It wasn't a perfect system. Down in the city, duels spilled into the streets. A Sith Lord hurling a Senate guard into a passing speeder train. A Jedi Knight deflecting blaster fire off mirrored skyscraper glass. Civilians running beneath clashing sabers, realizing that the war they had watched on holofeeds had finally come home. One by one, key buildings went dark. The Judicial Department Tower, the Communications Nexus, Treasury, Ministry of Defense. The Republic's entire command structure was being decapitated in real time, while its negotiators were still politely debating tariff revisions on Alderaan. And that was the real terror. Not just the casualties, but the implication. Coruscant was the supposed safest world in the galaxy. The world that had survived the Great Hyperspace War, Mandalorian sieges, and 1,000 separatist uprisings. If the Sith could occupy that sky, storm that temple, ransack those offices, then nowhere was beyond their reach. Cut back to the Senate. Not the debating chamber in session, but the chamber in chains, smoke hanging under the great dome, desks scorched, senators herded together by silent helmeted soldiers. At the central podium, where chancellors in practice, those demilitarized zones became corridors the Sith used to pressure nearby worlds, while the ceasefire froze entire Republic armies in place, stranded on planets now officially behind enemy lines. This is the story of entire populations waking up to find that their home was no longer in the Republic, without a single shot fired that day. 1 week, a world sent representatives to the Senate. The next, those senators were told their world had been transferred to Sith jurisdiction. No evacuation plans, no meaningful resistance, just a legal sentence that turned citizens into subjects. The signing itself was a humiliation broadcast in whispers. Senators affixed their names under duress, with Sith troops still occupying districts of Coruscant and orbital guns trained on the capital. The Jedi Council received a simple order from the Senate: stand down, comply with the treaty, abandon forward positions. Knights who had bled for years on the front watched as the worlds they'd defended were handed away in a conference room. For many citizens, this felt less like peace and more like betrayal. Refugee convoys jammed hyperlanes out of newly seeded systems. Local defense forces were told to disarm while Sith legions landed in ceremonial formation. The Republic still existed. It just looked smaller, diminished, afraid. So why did the Sith agree to stop when their armies had just proven they could strike the Republic's heart? Because Vitiate was playing a longer game than Conquest by attrition. A galaxy divided into hostile blocks, with a weakened Republic, a triumphant but overextended Sith Empire, and millions of furious civilians caught between them, created more fear, more hatred, and more instability than a simple annexation ever could. That was about to change very quickly, but not in the way most generals expected. The immediate aftermath looked calm on star charts, and anything but on the ground. Border skirmishes flared in accidental engagements. Proxy wars erupted as Sith-backed warlords and Republic-friendly militias fought over neutral systems. Intelligence agencies on both sides expanded faster than their navies. The war had gone cold, not gone away. Both superpowers rearmed in the shadows. The Republic poured credits into rebuilding fleets and fortifying the new frontier. The Sith Empire consolidated its gains, strip-mined captured worlds, and funneled resources into secret projects in the unknown regions, where even Jedi scouts hesitated to go. The planet was Coruscant. The year was one of supposed peace, but for many in the galaxy, this was when the Sith Empire became truly terrifying, not because its armies were advancing, because now the Senate had signed a line that recognized the Sith as a permanent legal superpower. The war on maps had ended. The war for the future of the Republic had just moved into the dark. On paper, the galaxy exhaled. The Great Galactic War was over. Borders conquered planets. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino for the Republic army, Vitiate had already built in the shadows for his own. Not clones, but programmable people. Brainwashed diplomats who would steer planetary senates toward neutrality and then quietly sign defense pacts with Dromund Kaas. Governors who woke up one day with someone else's orders in their heads and no memory of how they got there. On worlds along the frontier, regimes changed without elections. A mining guild on a mid-rim moon refused imperial tariffs on one day and begged for Sith protection the next. A reformist council on another world dissolved overnight after a scandal that only existed in forged hollow records. It wasn't a perfect system. Sometimes an asset broke conditioning, sometimes a forged scandal was exposed. But by then, the damage was already done. The Jedi had to adapt. No more leading legions into open battle. Now a knight and a single Padawan might be dispatched to quietly unmask a Sith agent on a trade world, or to observe a planetary election everyone knew was being rigged from Dromund Kaas. The council walked a tightrope, exposed too much, and the Senate might panic and restart the war. Exposed too little, and the Sith would win it without firing a shot. For ordinary citizens, the era felt haunted. Rumors of red-bladed assassins on skylanes. Journalists vanishing after criticizing pro-imperial senators. A neighbor leaving for a business trip into imperial space and never coming back, except in whispered reports that he was now an advisor to some Sith governor. While the Republic and the Senate obsessed over tariffs, patrol routes, and spy scandals, the real threat sat far beyond the border. On Dromund Kaas, behind storms and secrecy, the immortal emperor watched both sides exhaust themselves over territory and pride. Because his true project wasn't about winning this stalemate at all. It was about draining far more than a single world. And when that plan finally surfaced, the entire galaxy would realize the Cold War had only been the prologue. Because for Vitiate, draining a single world was just proof of concept. Nathema was the prototype. The galaxy was the real target. His ultimate goal was never a stable throne, a loyal senate, or even a permanent Sith victory over the Republic. Those were distractions. What the immortal emperor wanted was a galaxy-spanning ritual, a chain reaction of annihilation that would consume every living thing, every Jedi, every clone, every civilian, and convert all that life into fuel. Not to rule as an emperor, but to ascend as something beyond the Force, beyond death, beyond the physical realm entirely. This is the story of a war that, from his perspective, was just the wiring diagram for a super ritual. The Sith Empire he rebuilt in the unknown regions, the Great Galactic War, even the uneasy Cold War that followed, all of it mapped pressure points. Signs. It wasn't mercy, it was calibration. Key worlds had been taken, others had been destabilized. The map now matched the ritual he wanted to cast. And the manipulation went both ways. Vitiate sabotaged his own empire almost as often as he sabotaged the Republic. Any Dark Council member who grew too independent mysteriously met an accident. Any Sith who dreamed of replacing him found their campaigns undermined. It wasn't a perfect system, but it ensured no faction, Jedi or Sith, Republic or Empire, could consolidate enough strength to stand against a final galaxy-scale drain. Compared to that, later Sith ambitions look almost provincial. Darth Sidious wanted to turn the Republic into an empire, to command fleets, to break the Jedi and rule for generations. Terrifying, yes, but still political. Vitiate wanted to turn the entire galaxy into a single sacrificial altar. If that plan had fully succeeded, there would have been no empire to inherit, no republic to restore, no Jedi to return. Just one devouring will in the dark. That was about to change very quickly though, because his downfall began with the same flaw every Sith carries into war, the belief that no one else can possibly outplay them. The Emperor's flaw wasn't just personal arrogance, it was systemic. It sat in a vast shadowy chamber of black stone and red light, where 12 thrones formed the beating heart of the Sith Empire's government, the Dark Council. On paper, this was elegant, rational. Each councillor ruled a sphere beneath the Emperor, an entire slice of the Empire's war machine. Defense commanded the fleets and legions. Intelligence ran spies, infiltrators, and quiet disappearances. Mysteries hoarded forbidden rituals and artifacts that could crack planets open. This is the story of an imperial cabinet, except every minister is a warlord, sorcerer, and mass murderer with near absolute authority in their domain. It wasn't a perfect system. It worked only as long as everyone feared the Emperor more than they hated each other. That was about to change very quickly whenever his attention drifted, because behind the formal titles and ceremonial masks, the real Dark Council was an arena. Assassination proposals traveled the same channels as budget requests. A motion of no confidence might arrive in the form of a poisoned drink or a shuttle with a sabotaged hyperdrive. Council sessions could begin as strategy briefings on the Great Galactic War and end as duels to the death. A Lord of Defense who questioned the sphere of mysteries about wasting dreadnoughts on relic hunts might find the entire chamber plunged into darkness, with invisible hands crushing his throat. A Minister of Intelligence who revealed too much about the Emperor's secrets could be challenged on the spot, their seat literally won or lost in a single flashing blur of red blades. And those duels didn't stay contained to the council chamber, when are constantly encouraged to be ready to strike them down. But that permanent state of internal war carried a price. Long-term planning eroded under short-term survival. Grand campaigns against the Republic were abandoned halfway through because a councillor needed to rush home and crush a coup. Superweapons meant for the galaxy ended up pointed at fellow Sith. The same brutality that made the Empire terrifying also hollowed it out from within. It could conquer. It could devastate. Holding those conquests, though, that was always slipping through its fingers, one betrayed councillor at a time. That hollow core was dangerous. Because when an empire keeps eating itself from the inside, the only way to project strength is to build horrors so big that no one dares test how weak it actually is. This is the story of the Sith turning fear itself into a weapon. The Republic built fleets, defenses, and the occasional questionable prototype. The Sith built monuments to annihilation. Imagine a cannon the size of a city, mounted on a dreadnought, its focusing arrays etched with runes from Korriban. Fire it once, and a planet's crust buckles, fault lines rip open, and continents slide into the sea. Technicians calibrated the beam. A circle of robed acolytes bled into the circuitry, amplifying it through the dark side. It wasn't a perfect system. Sometimes the cannon misfired and shattered the Sith ship instead. No one in the council cared, as long as the next test hit a Republic world. Then there were the transmitters, not just jamming signals or propaganda broadcasts, but mass hypnosis engines, towering arrays on captured hyperwave relays, tuned by Sith sorcerers to ride every channel across a sector. One activation, and entire populations felt a single emotion. Despair, obedience, or blind rage turned against their own governors. Armies collapsed before the first dropship landed. The Separatists had droids. The Sith had something far more efficient, a galaxy that would choose surrender on its own. Their warships reflected the same logic. Colossal flagships with reactors chained directly to pits full of enslaved force sensitives, their pain driven through focusing crystals to power shields and super lasers. The ship flew faster when they suffered. It hit harder when they died. Republic captains looked at sensor readings and saw impossible energy outputs with no visible fuel source. The message was clear. The Sith were willing to spend lives as casually as Tibanna gas. Beneath those ships and cannons sat older, quieter terrors. Tomb worlds like Korriban, Ziost, and Malachor were armories as much as graveyards. Holocrons that whispered in Jedi minds, offering forbidden techniques and slowly rewriting their loyalties. Blades forged in sacrificial forges, drinking life energy with every wound and feeding it back to their wielders. Relics hammered into the bedrock of conquered planets, anchoring dark side nexuses so that the very air pushed back against Jedi and made every meditation feel like drowning. These weren't just battlefield tools. They were theater, prototypes, and the real endgame was still waiting in the shadows. The Jedi had seen Dark Jedi before, fallen knights, lone warlords, dangerous but familiar. This was different. This was the story of an entire civilization weaponized by the dark side. When the first Republic scouts stumbled into Sith space, the shock was almost theological. Whole academies training Sith warriors, temples where sorcerers bled prisoners for power, an army of indoctrinated soldiers raised from birth to obey Sith lords who treated cruelty as policy. The Jedi weren't facing a rogue cult. They were facing a mirror image of their own order, scaled up into an empire. That was about to change very quickly for the Council. The old doctrine, negotiate first, duel the ringleader if necessary, collapsed the moment flotillas of Sith warships jumped into Republic systems. Single combat heroics meant nothing against massed artillery and alchemical bioweapons. So the Jedi did something they rarely admitted to in later centuries. They started thinking in terms of campaigns. Strike teams became the new ideal. Small mobile groups of Jedi infiltrating behind enemy lines, targeting Sith governors, ritual sites, and command nexuses. Guardians trained not just to win duels, but to break chains of command. Disable the battle station, capture the Dark Council envoy, disrupt the fuel depots that kept the Sith army moving. Consulars, once focused on quiet diplomacy, were pushed into war rooms, plotting hyperspace raids instead of peace conferences. The Sith hit back on a different front, the mind. Battlefields turned into psychic pressure cookers as Sith sorcerers flooded the Force with fear, rage, and hallucinations. Jedi who had spent lifetimes meditating in quiet temples suddenly found their thoughts invaded mid-swing. In response, the Order built specialized training regimens, mental fortresses, shared mantras, paired meditation exercises designed to let a squad shield each other's minds in combat. It wasn't a perfect system, but it meant more Jedi came back from the front able to sleep. Out of this crucible came new archetypes. Guardians like Lord Hoth centuries later drew on doctrines first written when Naga Sadow's successors were still raiding the core. Consulars such as Oden blended scholarship and warfare, developing battle meditation into a strategic weapon that could steady entire Republic fleets while subtly fraying Sith morale. This is where Jedi General stopped being an insult and became a grim job description. The cost was spiritual. Years of trench worlds, sacked colonies, and Sith rituals that stripped life from planets pushed Jedi closer to the emotional edge. Anger felt efficient. Vengeance felt earned. Some Jedi snapped, crossing the line into the very darkness they were fighting. Others hardened in quieter ways, trimming compassion in the name of victory, turning mercy into a luxury. The lightning crawled across towers of black stone and durasteel, all sharp angles and looming statues of robed Sith lords staring down at everyone who walked the streets. It wasn't a perfect system. It didn't need to be. The point was intimidation, not comfort. On Dromund Kaas, the Emperor was not a politician, the Emperor was a god. Children grew up reciting loyalty oaths before they could read. Holograms of the Emperor's masked visage flickered in plazas, promising glory and warning of traitors. Citizens learned early that the real danger wasn't the army or the police. It was the red-bladed figure who could appear without warning, declare someone disloyal, and end a bloodline in a single gesture. Fear was the local currency, and everyone paid in advance. Far from the old Sith core, a newly conquered Republic world experienced the fist in a different way. One day, the Senate flag still hung in the capital square. That was about to change very quickly. The next, Sith warships eclipsed the sun, and the planetary shields went down under turbo laser fire. Curfews arrived first, then checkpoints, then the gallows. Public executions became weekly events, framed as justice against separatists and Jedi sympathizers, even when the victims were school teachers or dock workers who had simply complained too loudly. Factories that once built civilian transports were retooled to feed the war machine. Forced labor quotas turned night shifts into death sentences. Local collaborators, ambitious politicians, crime bosses, even former Republic officers, rose fast by parroting Sith ideology about strength and obedience. The Senate had been replaced by a governor with a direct comm line to a dark councillor, and that governor understood exactly how replaceable he was. Not everyone accepted it. Underground resistance cells formed in basements and abandoned warehouses. A half-trained Jedi Knight who had survived the initial invasion quietly taught a handful of recruits how to move unseen through the Force. Smugglers who once ran spice now ran refugees, slipping families past planetary interdiction grids in battered freighters with transponder codes that changed every jump. Ordinary engineers sabotaged fuel lines, corrupted targeting software, and made maintenance errors that sent dropships crashing on takeoff. The Sith answered with selective cruelty and selective reward. Worlds that bent the knee quickly might keep their local customs, their planetary militias, even their old flags, now flying beneath the imperial emblem. Loyal governors were elevated, granted titles, estates, and the illusion of autonomy, as long as the tribute flowed and the arrests kept coming. Planets that resisted too effectively were made examples. Bombardments, mass deportations, inquisitors arriving to personally oversee interrogations. For billions across the galaxy, the Sith Empire wasn't an abstract dark side philosophy debated by the Council. Rebellious moon in the Stygian caldera had its atmosphere vented as a teaching aid. This is the story of how every successful uprising became a cautionary legend, passed in whispers through barracks and slave pens, proving that resistance was possible and that the price would be catastrophic. Inside the Sith military, the fractures ran quieter but cut deeper. Commanders who had fought through the Great Galactic War had seen too many examples made. Villages burned not for strategy, but for amusement. Officers who had once believed in imperial order watched their own troops thrown into meat grinder assaults just to prove that a Dark Council member was strong. Some began dragging their feet on extermination orders. Others went further. A cruiser lost in a hyperspace misjump conveniently reappeared near a Republic patrol. An ammunition depot on a rebellious world malfunctioned at exactly the right moment for local resistance fighters. So what Obi-Wan found, centuries later in Republic archives, were after-action reports that didn't quite add up. Sith units that broke at the wrong time, sensors that failed just long enough for a convoy of refugees to escape. It wasn't a perfect system, but it showed that even inside the war machine, conscience and self-preservation were quietly sabotaging the Empire's total control. And then there were the rebellions only a Sith could truly stage. Ambitious lords on Korriban and Dromund Kaas didn't dream of mercy. They dreamed of replacing the Emperor. Rival academies turned training duels into assassinations. Fleets were redirected without orders, plunging entire sectors into miniature civil wars as Darths and would-be emperors tested each other's strength, using the galaxy as their arena. That was about to change very quickly whenever the Emperor intervened. One lord's coup on Ziost ended with his blood used in a public ritual, broadcast across the holonet as his fleet was remotely crashed into the planet's surface. Planets that had hosted rebel Sith were stripped of rank, resources, sometimes population. Fear became both whip and glue, the only thing holding this collection of warlords together. But if an empire has to keep burning itself just to stay warm, how long before there's nothing left to burn? The next phase of the war would push that question to its breaking point. The answer came on a battlefield. For decades, the Sith had written the script of the war. They chose when to strike, which worlds to burn, which treaties to break. The Republic and the Jedi just reacted. That was about to change very quickly. The first real crack was not some apocalyptic superweapon. It was logistics. When the Republic Navy finally coordinated simultaneous strikes along 3 major hyperlanes, Sith fleets that had always arrived on cue didn't. A task force sent to reinforce Balmorra never left its staging point. A garrison on Corellia ran out of munitions mid-siege. The myth of the unstoppable Red Tide met the reality of missed shipments and empty fuel depots. Then occupied populations, promised order in exchange for obedience, got random purges instead. Rebellions flared on worlds that had never heard of the Jedi, driven less by ideology and more by hunger and humiliation. It wasn't a perfect system. The Dark Council had been designed as a brutal balance of power, each Sith Lord checking the others through fear. In peacetime, that meant paralysis. In wartime, it meant something worse. Assassinations spiked every time the Empire needed decisive coordination. A planned counterattack would stall because the admiral in charge had been poisoned the night before. A sector defense collapsed because 2 council members refused to reinforce each other unless the other one failed first. This is the story of an empire that could win duels but kept losing months. Over all of this, Vitiate drifted upward into abstraction. The emperor who had once micromanaged invasions now cared more about his grand ritual than the daily survival of his own armies. Orders from Dromund Kaas grew rarer, shorter, more cryptic. Hold. Delay. Prepare. Generals stopped waiting. Ambitious Sith declared themselves the true voice of the throne, then died trying to prove it. So what Obi-Wan found, centuries later, was the fossil record of a pattern. When a Sith center becomes immortal and untouchable, it also becomes unreachable. The outer provinces started acting like independent kingdoms with matching uniforms. Governors skimmed resources. Admirals made their own truces. On the map, the Empire still looked whole. Up close, the edges were already fraying. And once the galaxy realized the Sith could be pushed, could actually be beaten, it began to push back. The Sith Empire, whole sectors ruled by fear. An immortal emperor no one could touch. That was about to change very quickly. Once the illusion of invincibility cracked, the war map flipped. The Republic, exhausted and half broke, started stringing together real campaigns instead of desperate holding actions. Jedi commanders stopped racing to every fire and picked a few to put out permanently. They went after shipyards, relay stations, and, most importantly, hyperlanes. Cut the arteries, starved the organs, so now you had battered Republic fleets punching into corridors the Sith thought were safe, the Hydean Way, the Perlemian, secondary routes that fed Dromund Kaas and Ziost. Every secured lane meant one more Sith sector cut off from reinforcements, one more garrison suddenly alone with a very angry local population it had been terrorizing for decades. Internal rebellions that had been simmering in the shadows started timing their uprisings to Republic offensives. When the fleet jumped in, the prisons were already on fire. On paper, the Sith still had the stronger army. More ships, more bodies, more super weapons that should have decided the war. In practice, command chains were breaking. Admirals refused to support rivals, fortress state, shielded, heavily armed, ruled by increasingly desperate Sith lords who promised final victory while watching their supply convoys vanish into hyperspace and never come back. And above all of them, Vitiate stepped away. The planet was Nathema. The year was centuries earlier. He had already proven he would sacrifice an entire world to survive. Now, as his empire buckled, he did the same on a political scale. He withdrew his presence from day-to-day rule, retreated into hidden sanctuaries, and began preparing new avatars and new identities. The government bearing his name could fall. His consciousness would not. So what Obi-Wan found in the Clone Wars, an elegant, invisible Sith plan hollowing out the Republic from within, was the distant echo of this moment. Once again, a Sith Empire that terrified the galaxy collapsed into warlords, cults, and scattered strongholds. Once again, its teachings bled into the cracks of history. The banners came down. The ideas did not. They waited in the dark, patient, until someone else was ready to pick them up. Those banners fell into fire and ruin, but the dark side did not go quiet. Out on the edges of the map, where old star charts fade and Republic beacons never reached, isolated Sith enclaves dug in. A fortress half buried in the ice of Ziost, a canyon city on Dromund Kaas where the lightning never stops. Small circles of surviving lords and apprentices clung to fragments of imperial doctrine, reciting half-remembered codes, drilling their handful of warriors as if an entire army still stood behind them. This is the story of an empire that refused to admit it was dead. They trained children on broken holoprojectors. They traced the sigils of Naga Sadow and Vitiate on cave walls. They told their acolytes that the war with the Jedi and the Republic was not lost, only delayed. That was about to change very quickly according to them, just as soon as the galaxy forgot to be afraid. The worlds that birthed the Sith became mausoleums and minefields at the same time. Korriban's tombs still whispered with the voices of dead kings. Secret temples, sealed by ancient councils, held holocrons that could teach planetary-scale rituals to anyone stubborn enough to survive their trials. Malakor's shattered surface hid vaults full of superweapons and battle relics from the last Great War against the Jedi. No Senate patrols, no Jedi archivists, just corridors of stone and metal waiting for new hands to claim them. It wasn't a perfect system. Holocrons corrupted, Guardians went rogue, entire chambers collapsed into the abyss. But enough survived that any wandering adept, any ambitious warlord, could stumble into a ready-made dark side education. The galaxy had turned these places into legends. The Sith treated them as supply depots. Some legacies didn't need temples at all. Certain Sith bloodlines went underground. A former Darth on the run would marry into a local noble house on a mid-rim world, pass on a new family name, and quietly test each child for sensitivity. These enclaves, bloodlines, and cults looked small, scattered, harmless, but together they were something else. A distributed archive of every failure and every insight the ancient Sith had ever produced. These were the fragments that future thinkers would study and refine. These were the seeds that would eventually feed into new, dark side movements, until one day a Sith named Bane would walk into this chaos of ruins and whispers and decide to burn almost all of it down. The question was how. Darth Bane's answer began with a question almost no Sith ever stopped long enough to ask: why do we keep losing? He was not an emperor with legions. He was not a warlord commanding fleets. He was a late-era Sith acolyte, standing on the graveyard of a 1,000-year conflict, looking backward instead of charging forward. The Republic still existed. The Jedi still held their council on Coruscant. But Bane could see the pattern the others refused to see. This is the story of a Sith who treated history as a weapon. In the archives and hidden vaults, Bane found what survived of those dead empires. Naga Sadow's grand designs, records of the Great Hyperspace War, accounts of Vitiate draining Nathema until an entire world went silent, just to make one ruler immortal. Fragmented holocrons from dark councils that had once argued over how many sectors each lord deserved to rule. So, what Obi-Wan found on Kamino for the Jedi, Bane now found in these ruins for the Sith, evidence of a plan that had always eaten itself. The pattern was brutally simple. Every time the Sith built a massive order, it turned inward. Thousands of lords, each claiming to be the strongest. An army of apprentices waiting for their chance to stab upward. Civil wars exploding in the middle of galactic war. The Republic did not always defeat the Sith. Often, the Sith defeated themselves, and the Republic just survived long enough to watch. It wasn't a perfect system, this rule of the strong. It produced terrifying empires, superweapons, whole fleets of fanatics. But it also guaranteed that the moment a leader faltered, a dozen rivals would tear the structure apart. Bane realized the weakness was not in the Jedi or the Republic or the Senate. The weakness was built into the Sith's own numbers. That was about to change very quickly. Bane's conclusion was radical minimalism. Too many Sith meant too many fault lines. Every additional Dark Lord diluted the dark side's focus, turned power into a chaotic free-for-all instead of a single sharpened blade. So he inverted the entire model. No more sprawling empires ruled openly by a council. No more legions of Sith competing for rank. One master, one apprentice. The master would embody power, carrying the accumulated knowledge of every fallen empire. The apprentice would crave that power, driven to surpass and eventually destroy the master. Each generation would compress the dark side further, direct war with the Republic, driving fleets straight at Coruscant from a visible capital on Korriban and Ziost. It looked unstoppable. It collapsed in a generation. Overextension, a war on too many fronts with too few reliable allies, against a galaxy that suddenly had a common enemy. The second failure mode was baked into Sith culture itself. Rule of the strong meant every victory just created a bigger target. Dark councils plotted against their own emperor. Apprentices sabotaged campaigns to embarrass their masters. Vitiate survived assassination after assassination, but his empire did not. When commanders fear each other more than the Jedi, the Republic doesn't have to win every battle. It just has to wait. Then there was visibility. The old Sith flew their banners over entire sectors. Red-skinned warriors, towering statues, superweapons parked in orbit as permanent reminders of who ruled the galaxy. It was efficient terror. It also made perfect propaganda. The Senate, the Jedi Council, even petty planetary governors could unite under one slogan: anything but that. A visible tyranny gave the Republic something to rally around. Finally, the emperors themselves drifted away from reality. Vitiate's Nathema ritual, Sadow's solar manipulations, all pointed in the same direction: godhood, immortality, cosmic apotheosis. While they chased divinity, logistics rotted, supply lines snapped, and the day-to-day work of actually holding an empire together fell to paranoid subordinates with their own agendas. That was about to change very quickly. Later, Sith studied these hollow records with almost academic detachment. Bane, then Plagueis, then Sidious. The holocrons preserved more than battle plans. They taught how to weaponize fear without announcing its source, how to cloud a Jedi's senses, how to fold dark side signatures behind layers of misdirection so the Council would feel a disturbance in the Force and never trace it to the Chancellor's office. So, what Obi-Wan found on Kamino, a secretly commissioned clone army rubber-stamped by the Senate, wasn't an improvisation. It was the refined product of lessons learned from Korriban and Dromund Kaas: subtlety over spectacle, infiltration over invasion. Use the Republic's own laws, courts, and committees as the new Dark Council. It wasn't a perfect system. It was better. Plagueis experimented in finance, genetics, and politics, not planetary rituals. Sidious buried himself inside the Republic's bureaucracy, inside the Jedi's blind faith in their own doctrine. No Sith banners, no Sith capital, just a smiling senator from Naboo. And in a final twist, the galaxy's terror of open Sith empires became its blind spot. Everyone was watching the borders for a new Naga Sadow or Vitiate. No one thought to look at the man chairing the Senate. Sidious understood that fear of the Sith was now his greatest camouflage. The Republic, the Jedjeks who'd had enough of being ruled by lightning and fear. That was about to change very quickly. The solution was simple and vicious. Don't oppose the Republic. Become it. Instead of building a rival empire in the unknown regions, Sidious hid inside the Senate. Instead of declaring a holy war on the Jedi, he let them lead his army. Democracy, bureaucracy, and war fatigue became his weapons. Emergency powers replaced coronation rituals. Committee votes did the work ancient superweapons used to do. It wasn't a perfect system. It was better. And while the public saw the polished marble of Coruscant, Sidious kept going back to the dirt and stone that had birthed the Sith. Korriban, later called Moraband, with its tombs of red-skinned kings and dark Jedi exiles. Malachor, still scarred by a superweapon that had petrified an entire battle in place. These weren't just archaeological sites. They were batteries, reservoirs of rage and worship and terror, soaked into the rock over millennia. Sidious plundered their holocrons, their rituals, their forgotten doctrines on immortality and mind control, feeding his power with the leftovers of dead empires. Publicly, though, there would be no Sith Emperor Palpatine. The title was poison. Instead, he presented himself as Supreme Chancellor, then later as Emperor of the Galactic Empire, a continuity of the Republic, not a replacement. No red skin, no Dark Council, just a constitutional transition, signed off by cheering senators and exhausted citizens who thought they were trading chaos for order. Underneath, almost nothing had changed. The rule of two sat on top of the rule of the strong. Ancient rites ran behind closed doors on Coruscant, the same way they once had on Ziost. Sidious's regime looked new, gleaming, rational. Its roots, its rituals, its endgame, the total subjugation of the galaxy to a single dark will, were straight out of the empires that once terrified the stars. And on one forgotten world, in one forgotten temple, something those old Sith left behind was about to wake up again. So now the question sitting under all of this becomes unavoidable. Which was actually more terrifying to live under? Vitiate's Ancient Sith Empire or Palpatine's Galactic Empire that came after? On paper, Vitiate's regime looks worse. The Ancient Sith Empire was not hiding behind a Senate or a constitution. It was an openly Sith state, a civilization that called itself an empire of the dark side. Whole sectors from Dromund, Kaas to Ziost were ruled by red banners, black armor, and an aristocracy of Sith lords who didn't pretend to be anything else. This is the story of a government where the word Sith on your HoloNet feed didn't mean rumor or myth. It meant the people who owned your planet. By contrast, the Galactic Empire began as a costume change. Same capital, same Senate building, same clone army marching in the same parade formations. That was about to change very quickly, but at first Palpatine wrapped his new order in the familiar symbols of the old Republic. The Sith nature of the regime, separatists, security, and protecting citizens from chaos. The fear came in paperwork and midnight knocks, in Tarkin's doctrine of rule by regional governors, in an ISB report that made a person disappear. The Death Star was marketed as a deterrent. Alderaan showed what the fine print actually said. On an existential level, though, Vitiate's project was in another category. The Nathema ritual did not just topple a government, it erased an entire world's life, including thousands of Sith to feed a single emperor. His long-term plan was to scale that up, consume the entire galaxy, end all independent existence, and exist alone in the dark. Palpatine, for all his monstrous ambition, still wanted a galaxy to rule. Vitiate wanted a galaxy to eat. Psychologically, that matters. Living under an immortal dark god who can devour planets turns every sunrise into a countdown. Living under a human tyrant with endless stormtroopers and super weapons feels different. There is at least the idea that tyrants can die, that armies can mutiny, that the Council or some hidden Jedi might strike back. The real horror is what happens when those two legacies stack. The Galactic Empire is terrifying precisely because it stands on the buried bones and forgotten lessons of those older Sith states. The planet was Coruscant. The year was 19 BBY, and almost no one in the Senate remembered Nathema when a new emperor promised peace. Because the next shadow, waking up in that forgotten temple, was about to remind the galaxy what the Sith used to be willing to do. The Sith Empires, worlds drained, armies shattered, whole sectors ruled by fear. And yet, every time the dark side rose to swallow the galaxy, something snapped inside the Sith themselves before the Republic ever fully finished the job. That was about to change very quickly, and then it didn't. Because the moment the old Sith orders reached their peak, the knives came out. Naga Sadow's invasion of the Republic during the Great Hyperspace War was sabotaged almost from the inside. His rival Ludo Kresh tried to depose him in the middle of a galactic campaign, turning what could have been a sustained war into a chaotic retreat. The Sith didn't just lose to the Jedi, they lost to each other first. This is the story of a pattern that kept repeating. Millennia later, Vitiate's hidden empire hit the Republic with the Great Galactic War. Fleets over Coruscant, Jedi dying in the streets, the Senate forced into the Treaty of Coruscant at sword point. On paper, the Sith had everything: territory, momentum, a terrified enemy. But inside the Empire, Dark Council members were already hoarding power, sabotaging rivals' offensives, and quietly planning coups against the very Emperor whose armies they served. So, what Obi-Wan found, centuries later, was only the echo of that failure. A republic that remembered Sith terror, but not the way Sith politics kept blowing their own empires apart. The paradox is built into the philosophy. If Vitiate had devoured all life in the known galaxy and remade reality as a dark side singularity, if Naga Sadow had not been undercut by Kresh at the exact moment the Republic staggered. In those branches of history, there is no rebel alliance, no Luke, no last stand on Endor. There is only an endless night. So the question hanging over every Sith empire is simple. Did the dark side save the galaxy from itself? Did the very drive for personal power that forged these conquerors also plant the seeds of their defeat? Or is the only reason the galaxy ever escapes Sith rule that the Sith can never stop trying to rule each other first? And while ancient Sith empires tore themselves apart with civil wars and superweapons, their ideas did not die. They went underground. They waited for someone patient enough, subtle enough, to weaponize the entire Republic instead of just another battle fleet. This is the story of Darth Sidious, taking 1,000 years of Sith failure and turning it into a 3-year masterclass in institutional manipulation. The old Sith learned the hard way that frontal assaults on the Republic only rallied the galaxy against them. Naga Sadow, Exar Kun, Vitiate's resurgent empire, each tried overwhelming force, and each time the Republic eventually adapted. That was about to change very quickly. From those defeats came a new doctrine. Do not just attack the Senate, infect it. Do not just fight the Jedi, make them generals in a war they cannot win. Ancient texts from Korriban and holocrons descended from Nathamas, survivors, all pointed toward the same conclusion. The most efficient way to destroy a civilization is to make it destroy itself, one emergency decree at a time. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino, a secret clone army ordered in the name of the Republic, paid for off the books, tied to a dead Jedi Master, was not an improvisation. It was the refined version of Sith projects that once built hidden armadas in the unknown regions and sleeper fleets in deep hyperspace. Secret armies, manufactured enemies, a war of attrition that bleeds every side except the one writing the script. On one side, the Grand Army of the Republic. On the other, the Separatists' endless droid legions. In the middle, a Senate terrified enough to hand out emergency powers the way ancient Sith Dark Councils handed out war titles. No Sith banners over Coruscant. No red-skinned warriors charging the Jedi Temple. Just fear, propaganda, and a chancellor who never gives the powers back. The Republic turns into an empire without a single Sith warship in the sky. The Jedi Council's role in this is not a new tragedy. It is a repetition. Millennia earlier, the Republic ignored warnings about a resurgent Sith Empire hiding beyond known space until it was almost too late. During the Clone Wars, the Council again misses the pattern. Visions, anomalies, a clone warning about an inhibitor chip, all dismissed or buried by the same complacency that once let Vitiate rebuild in secret. It wasn't a perfect system, and the physical ghosts of those of war. That was about to change very quickly, and then somehow it didn't. The Sith Imperial machine that had once hurled fleets at Coruscant, that had drained entire worlds like Nathama, simply vanished from the Republic's story, not in reality, on paper, in memory. Over millennia, the Republic and the Jedi did what comfortable victors always do. They turned existential terror into curriculum. Naga Sadow, the Great Hyperspace War, Vitiate's hidden empire in the unknown regions, all of it slid out of living fear and into dusty archive. The Sith became a past threat, a cautionary tale, a unit in a temple history course about why vigilance matters, recited by initiates who had never seen a Sith warship in real space. The Council helped write that narrative. Every time a new crisis hit the galaxy, Mandalorian raids, pirate kings, separatists in some border sector, the Sith were framed as the old enemy that had already been defeated. The phrase, 1,000 years of peace, did a lot of heavy lifting. So did the comforting idea that the Sith had collapsed under their own greed and infighting. It was true. It wasn't a perfect system. But it taught the wrong lesson, because while the Republic was filing the Sith under ancient history, Darth Bane's line was busy. This is the story of a civilization that terrified the galaxy, learning from its own downfall, then deliberately erasing its fingerprints. The rule of two only works if no one is looking for it. No one was. The last Sith anyone remembered commanded legions, dark councils, whole armadas. So what Obi-Wan found, when he went digging in the archives centuries later, was a pattern. Loud empires that burned bright and died. No one imagined the opposite pattern. Two Sith, no banners, no armies with red insignia, just a master and an apprentice moving through the Republic's institutions instead of against them. Why would the Senate suspect a hidden conspiracy that every history text insisted could not exist anymore? Why would the Jedi scan a friendly politician for traces of a religion they had already declared extinct? Sidious lived inside that blind spot. First as a senator from Naboo, then as Supreme Chancellor, standing in the very chamber where, 1,000 years earlier, panicked delegates had once debated Sith invasions. The Council trusted the story of their own victory. They believed the age of Sith empires was over forever, that any new darkness would at least look familiar. Sidious did not build a new Korriban. He built a clone army. So the most successful lie the Sith ever told was not a single forged report, not one false identity or manipulated vote. It was the galaxy's belief that the Sith were gone, that the nightmare of Sith imperial power was finished and safely in the past. The war that follows is fought in that shadow, which is why this entire video functions as an act of remembrance. By reconstructing the story of the Sith Empire once, it did not recognize the second one because this time the Empire was being built from the inside out. In both eras, the same pressure points appear: external crisis, internal rot, corruption in the Senate, infighting in the Council, corporate cartels, buying votes while frontier worlds feel abandoned. The ancient Sith hammered those fractures with war fleets and superweapons. Sidious does it with manufactured war, a clone army and a legal coup. Different tools, same blueprint. Fear is the bridge between them, fear of chaos, fear of another great hyperspace war. When the Republic has already watched a single ritual on Nathema wipe out an entire planet's life, the promise of order becomes very persuasive. In the Old Republic, worlds accept Sith occupation because the alternative is annihilation. In the prequels, planets cheer when the Grand Army marches in because at least someone is in control. Brutality becomes tolerable as long as it is predictable. That is the quiet genius of Sith strategy. The regime does not have to call itself Sith to be Sith in method. Authoritarian rule, secret police, endless war, an emperor who never leaves office, those are the same instruments Naga Sadow and Vitiate used. Sidious just files the serial numbers off and runs them through the Senate. The other constant is blindness. After Revan, after the Great Galactic War, the Jedi convince themselves the worst is behind them. The temples are rebuilt. The archives are full. The Sith empires are extinct. It wasn't a perfect system, but it felt stable. By the time of the Clone Wars, the Council treats those old catastrophes as history problems, not active warnings. So what Obi-Wan found on Kamino, a secretly commissioned clone army waiting for a war no one had declared, should have rung every alarm bell from Coruscant to Ossus. Instead, it was folded into business as usual. Star Wars keeps returning to these cycles for a reason. Republic, Empire, Republic again. Each rise and fall traces back to the same refusal to remember how bad it got last time. Forget Nathema, and Starkiller Base feels new. Forget the Great Hyperspace War, and the Clone Wars look heroic instead of engineered. So, when this video says the Sith Empire terrified the entire galaxy, it is not just talking about fleets and rituals. It is talking about recognition. The terror is realizing how easily ordinary fear, ordinary complacency can rebuild that empire in a different uniform. And that brings the story to its final question. After everything the galaxy has already survived, what exactly is still waiting in the dark? So when this video says the Sith Empire terrified the entire galaxy, it is really talking about a wound that never fully closed, a wound that started with a forgotten species on a dead world and ended with entire star systems flinching at the word Sith. This is the story of a civilization that burned very quickly, because the galaxy thought the Sith were gone. In reality, Vitiate had already eaten a world. Nathema, an entire planet drained to ash and silence so one emperor could live forever. From that atrocity, he built a hidden empire in the unknown regions, trained a new army, and came back in the Great Galactic War with something worse than invasion: patience, world-eating rituals, cities flensed by orbital bombardment. The sacking of Coruscant carried out under a fake peace negotiation, turning the Republic's capital into a hostage and a message. The terror wasn't just the casualties, it was the realization that nowhere was safe. Not the core, not the temples, not the Senate chambers. The Sith turned uncertainty itself into a weapon. Even after the Empire's banners fell, its shadows remained, ruined worlds on the rim, force-scarred planets where hyperspace routes still detoured around invisible trauma. Populations that had watched their cities offered up in dark rituals and never trusted a Jedi promise again. The Order's doctrines changed too. New rules on attachment, secrecy, and how to respond when the word Sith appeared in a council briefing. Over time, the empires themselves became legend. But legends have gravity. Holocrons in forgotten vaults kept whispering. Tombs on Korriban and Ziost kept calling. The very phrase Sith Empire turned into both a myth and a warning, shaping how the Republic reacted to every rumor of a dark side warlord, every masked figure with a red blade. So what does that leave? A story about power pursued at any cost, fear used as a governing philosophy, and a galaxy that keeps deciding which parts of that story to remember and which parts to bury, until the next empire digs them back up. The Sith Empire. Worlds burned, Jedi hunted, whole sectors ruled by fear. And yet the most terrifying thing about it wasn't the fleets in the sky. It was the fact that it never really went away. The banners fell, the temples cracked, the last great armadas of the ancient Sith vanished into the unknown regions or into legend. That was about to change very quickly, because the Empire did what the Sith always do when the war turns against them. It stopped calling itself an empire and started calling itself a plan. This is the story of an institution that kept changing shape to survive. From Naga Sadow's war against the Republic to Vitiate draining Nathema and ruling a hidden empire in the dark, the Sith kept testing one core idea: rule through fear at any scale available. Open theocracy on Korriban, shadow government in Dromund Kaas, and eventually something smaller and much more durable: two Sith at a time, embedded directly into the Republic's own systems. Darth Bane walked through the ruins of that old Sith civilization and saw failure written on every broken statue. Councils, armies, rival lords tearing each other apart while the Jedi and the Senate picked off the survivors. His answer was the rule of two, not much to ancient Sith alchemy as to modern engineering. Palpatine's throne room on the second Death Star is arranged like a dark side temple. Even in Rebels, when Kanan and Ezra step into old Sith sites on Malachor, the ghosts of that first empire are still teaching new lessons in fear. And when the sequels introduce relic hunters, cults on Exegol, and star destroyers rising from hidden shipyards, that isn't a new threat. That's the original Sith playbook photocopied one more time. Fleets in the sky, whispers in the Senate, a dyad in the Force instead of a dark council, but the same blueprint underneath. The most successful lie the Sith ever told was convincing the galaxy they were extinct. In reality, they went quiet. They let the Jedi relax. They let the Republic forget what a real Sith Empire looked like, while their ideas, rituals, and architectural plans for tyranny sat in vaults and holocrons, waiting for someone ambitious enough to open them. The planet was Korriban. The year was irrelevant. The tombs are silent now. Sand has swallowed the old academies. The last banners have rotted on their poles. But the dark side doesn't care about monuments. As long as there are people in the galaxy willing to trade compassion for control, security for submission, there is room for another empire to rise. Maybe not with the same name, maybe not with the same colors. The Jedi can clear the temples, the Republic can rewrite its laws. Yet somewhere, in a forgotten crypt or a senator's private office, a red holocron lights up again, and the galaxy takes one more small step back toward Korriban. So, when a red holocron flickers back to life in some forgotten crypt, this isn't just a spooky prop in the background. This is the story of a galaxy that keeps looping through the same nightmare, from Korriban's tombs to the Senate's polished marble floors. For anyone who wants to follow that nightmare all the way through, there are some natural next chapters. The Old Republic era on its own is a full war epic. The Great Hyperspace War, with Naga Sadow nearly erasing the Jedi, the resurgent Empire under Vitiate burning worlds from the shadows, the Republic trying to hold together an army that is always one step behind the Sith. Different millennia, same pattern. A Republic that thinks the Sith are gone, a council that underestimates the enemy, an empire that was about to change very quickly from rumor to open war. Then there is the bridge between those ancient empires and the rule of two. Darth Bane walking through the graveyard of Sith history, studying exactly how these empires rose and why they collapsed. His life is basically one long audit of Sith failure. Too many lords sharing power, too many egos, too much spectacle, not enough patience. Out of that, he forges a new doctrine that eventually hands Darth Sidious the keys to the Republic. The planet was Ruusan. The year was 1,000 years before the Clone Wars. It wasn't a perfect system. Heavy deep dive about a dead empire. Which part of this Sith history should be slowed down even more? A full breakdown of the Great Hyperspace War, ship by ship. A character study of Vitiate, the emperor who ate a planet. A closer look at how the Jedi Council kept misreading the same threat for thousands of years. The comments are where the next timeline gets decided. Long-form lore takes time. Sourcing old comics, legends novels, MMO storylines, reference books. Every like, Every comment, every subscription tells the algorithm this galaxy-sized homework is worth doing and keeps these massive timelines possible because the next deep dive is already forming. Maybe it follows the entire Old Republic era from First Contact to Final Treaty. Maybe it walks through Darth Bane's life, moment by moment, until the rule of two snaps into focus. Either way, the next red holocron is waiting to be opened. Because the next red holocron is waiting to be opened. And behind every one of those holocrons, behind every new Sith story, is the same image the saga keeps circling. A civilization built on the dark side, an empire born from exile, forged by fallen Jedi on Korriban, rising out of the shadows to nearly consume the galaxy, and then vanishing again into legend. This is the story of a war that never really ends, it just changes masks. Naga Sadow's fleets burning across the stars in the Great Hyperspace War. Vitiate standing on Nathema, one ritual away from becoming a void in human shape. Darth Bane in the ruins, looking at a dead empire and quietly deciding to turn it into a knife instead of a banner. By the time the Republic meets Darth Sidious, the Council thinks it understands the Sith. Two Dark Lords, one secret apprentice, a manageable threat. That was about to change very quickly, because the truth is that Sidious is not an exception. He is the final export of an entire culture that spent thousands of years perfecting how to hollow out a government from the inside. It is easy, in universe and as fans, to keep the camera tight on the Skywalkers and the Clone Wars. The planet was Geonosis. The year was 22 BBY. Clones in white armor, Jedi in brown robes, separatists in metal ranks. It feels self-contained, almost modern. But none of that exists without the older current underneath it, the long experiment in Sith Empire building that taught Sidious exactly how to turn a Senate into a weapon and a Jedi Order into an exposed nerve. So the next time the camera lingers on a Sith holocron in the Jedi archives, that isn't just a spooky prop. That is a data core from a dead empire, whispering the same lessons that built Korriban's tombs and Nathema's crater. Every dark temple on some outer rim world, every senator who flinches when the word emergency powers hits the floor is reacting to a pressure that started thousands of years earlier. It wasn't a perfect system.